last 100 years maybe. So we don't practice that anymore. So we need to bring back these sort of traditional practices to be able to incorporate it, and also so that we can better adapt ourselves to climate change. And the other thing was the lack of collaboration and coordination among stakeholders, with government, with other civil societies, even within young youth groups. And I think this is not only an issue for us in the Pacific, it's a global issue, like the lack of collaboration, coordination, vertically and horizontally. Thank you. Thank you. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, which is the first part of this session. The next session, I would like to call on to stage 3 speakers from the Pacific who will talk on various thematics. So I'll call on Ms. Kaya Lal, Mr. Sivendra Michael, and Amasai Cheke. Thank you. So this is just a panel discussion. They will briefly talk about their areas of work in Fiji and the Pacific in relation to climate change and disaster risk resilience. So, who wants to go first? Kaya?
Oh, I was thinking
okay.
Not.
Michael, would you like to go first? Okay, so it's the ladies first. Kaya is a barrister in her occupation, and she's been heavily involved. She's attended COP since COP 15, was it?
Lima. Which one was Lima? No, Lima was 2019. No, 2020.
COP 20.
So last fall.
And she was recently one of the participants of the the inaugural Oceans and Climate Youth Ambassador Program under the Peace Boat and the Alliance of Small Island States. So,
thank you for that. Ooh, can everyone hear me? No. Can everyone hear me? Ooh, that got very loud. So as Langi said, my name is Kaya. I currently live in Suva, Fiji. I work in Suva as a lawyer. I'm a practicing barrister, which means I'm a litigator. This is my 4th COP and my 4th KOI, so I've been around a little while now. And I've worked in and around climate issues probably going on 9-10 years now, so a little while now. And even though day to day I don't practice in environmental or climate law, I'm a general practitioner, I am still lucky enough that my academic specialization and my passion lies in climate and environmental law. So for me, my biggest issue and my biggest focus within climate change and environmental law is around the issue of sea level rise. So a lot of people look at sea level rise and they see it as a one-dimensional issue, which is the issue that sea level rise is going to sink small island states. And it goes back to this issue of Pacific Islands being characterized as sinking islands, Atlantis states that are drowning. But sea level rise is actually, for small islands and for the Pacific especially, is a much more complicated process and a very complicated process in law, actually. And so my focus has been on the impact that sea level rise is going to have on statehood and sovereignty for Pacific Islands. And this is because when our international legal system was created, it was created at a time when climate change was not thought of. It was not at the forefront of mindsets when these issues were established and subsequent treaties were made. So the way our current international legal system is shaped, it's written under a treaty called the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. And in the International Law of the Sea Convention, the way that it is written, it means that every country that has an ocean has the ability to also generate what is called an exclusive economic zone, and a number of you have probably heard of them. So within these areas, countries have the legal jurisdiction, they have the ability to fish and conduct certain activities, including deep sea mining. But the problem lies in the fact that in order to draw the line around your country and say where exclusive economic zones are, you have to take their measurement from where the land begins, or what is called technically as a baseline. The issue is baselines are not fixed, they are ambulatory, which means that they can move. And this might not seem like a major problem, but the measurement is taken from where our coasts begin, our low water mark. As sea levels rise, our coasts erode, and the low water mark where this measurement is being taken from is slowly moving inwards, which means that if you look at it on face value over time, the length and the breadth of the area that we can claim is going to be reduced. It's going to get smaller. And so for islands that are predominantly sea, the majority of our territory and our economic zones lie in our ocean. It means that over time, the areas that we can claim, work in, have jurisdiction over, fish in, or even mine in, which is something we're trying to avoid, will get smaller. And that is significantly detrimental to us. But it's also detrimental for a second reason. Because as sea levels rise in the Pacific, and for a number of other countries, for islands, we're seeing all over the world that coasts are eroding. So as coasts erode, sea levels rise, coasts erode, and then seawater is more likely to seep into these islands. In a large parts of the Pacific, our water sources are driven from thin freshwater lenses that sit basically just at the top of these islands, which are only a few meters above sea level. Once salt water gets into these pools of water, basically, it means that they are no longer drinkable. They become overly salinated. We can't drink from them. We can't use them to grow crops. We can't use them to graze animals. And the irony of being from a small island is that we are surrounded by the ocean every day, but too much salt water and it becomes poisonous for our crops, and eventually things die off. So while we might be able to remain on our lands, on our islands, once this, even once sea level erosion is happening and sea levels are rising, over time, when you can no longer have drinkable water on your island, when you can no longer have economic opportunities on your island, when you no longer have the ability to hold down a job or send your children to school, when you're reliant solely on aid, and even once we've reached a point beyond that, our islands are technically could be rendered uninhabitable. And this means that people are no longer able to live there and enjoy a fulfilling life. Once this happens, under our current legal system, we're facing the possibility that our countries and our territories will essentially lose the ability to govern themselves. So they'll lose their sovereignty over both the land that we call home as well as the ocean territories that we claim and are around us. So my focus has been predominantly in working to raise awareness around this issue, the fact that sea level rise isn't just sinking island states. It is the potential for our countries to become completely uninhabitable, completely unlivable, and then beyond that, where we no longer have a place that we can call home, a place that we can live, a place that we have sole legal jurisdiction and authority over. And that then comes into play these issues of climate displaced persons, because we wholly and wholeheartedly reject the notion within law of climate refugees. And also within the legal system, this idea of climate refugees actually is incorrect. So currently, a lot of people see poster children, we see sinking island states, but we don't actually see or understand what's happening and behind that, and the extent and the level of that impact. So a lot of the work I do is at COPs, at conferences within academia, to essentially try and raise awareness of these issues within the discourse and these issues within like the technical legislation. So if anyone has questions afterwards, I'll let you do that, but for now I'm going to pass on to my colleagues.
Bula Vinaka, everyone. Hello. My name is Sivendra Michael, and I am a PhD researcher at the University of Auckland, where my PhD focuses on building resilient, disaster-resilient local communities post-TC Winston experiences. Actually, I chose to do PhD based on my personal experiences, and particularly on this topic, having lived through multiple natural disasters, or I have experienced multiple disasters over the past decade. It's no joke for us. It's a reality, this topic for me today is something that for as long as I live, it will always be in my heart. As Langi had shared, that Fiji over time has learned, and most recently from devastating TC Winston, how we need to build resilience. If I have to share memories that flash through my mind right now about TC Winston, you'd probably be shedding tears with me for the people in the small island states. I recall people asking me question, can you imagine bures, houses, and objects flying right in front of you, yet you can't do anything but protect your own family and feel helpless? How would you respond to that? Going to school and seeing people sleeping on tents and cold floors with nothing at all, and yet only thing you can provide is what you have inside your house. As we remember what has happened a year ago, today I will share with you what are some of the things that youths of Fiji are doing in terms of building resilience, and how that has brought about, how this advocacy has brought about policy lessons that has been inspired, and how we progress to today, being the president of the COP23 meeting. The work that, apart from being a PhD researcher, I also am a social entrepreneur for a project that is out of called Active Citizens Fiji. What we do is basically we inspire young individuals like yourselves to tell better stories, but particularly to provide them a platform where they can use their talents to do business and make profit, but where the profit goes to addressing a climate issue. So for example, the practical things that we have been doing as youths are building seawalls in the communities where water literally comes inside the house at every high tide. We are building, the proceeds are used to build by piles, where people are building, I wish I could show you images, where people build houses on piles. So if their house is currently on a ground level, they will lift the houses on piles, and youths pretty much help in the village. We also help with the planting of mangroves, as was shown. This is basically just a long-term sustainability work that we do to try and cut down on the impact of the waves that erode our coastal shorelines. And then we also, to the last resort, help humanitarian organizations like Red Cross and the Fijian government to help youths of our age to come to terms about relocation due to climate change. It's a very sensitive topic which can be discussed and I can answer a lot of questions about that, because relocation is something that is very dear to us, predominantly because our traditional values and the land that we acquire belong to our forefathers. So leaving that and leaving the livelihoods that we have built over time and moving to a new place is not easy. So hence the importance of building resilience, the ability to adapt, to absorb, and to respond to natural disasters. So the work that we do are based on 5 assumptions, and the first one is to build resilience and sustainable development. Natural hazards must be addressed in a way which will reduce vulnerability first, and then secondly, it must be based on a way that sustainable development requires the need for national ownership and leadership. So the success stories in disaster reduction will help us to initiate action at within our own households, as individuals, and within the community. A commitment to innovation and learning is needed. Of course, we have our traditional practices, but when we have technology or something that can help us progress faster to build resilience, such as the monitoring, the German government had recently and the Japanese government had invested in technology that can measure the rise in sea level. So when the sea level comes to a certain point, there is a siren that rings automatically to alarm the people in the village. So this village in Vatua, what they do is they put all the household items on top of the bed, so that if there's a king tide or king wave coming, they know that the household items won't get damaged. It's an adaptation measure, more like. So yes, we really need that commitment. So what is required from us as regional institutions, before I go on to share the advocacy work, is to identify actions. We have identified 5 priority actions. One is to ensure that I'm focusing here on disaster risk, because disaster is that makes us most vulnerable as well, and it's because of changing climate conditions. We need to ensure that disaster risk reduction is a national and a local priority, with strong institutional basis for implementation of necessary measures. To do this, we need to identify and assess and monitor disaster risk and enhance early warning systems. We need to use knowledge, which includes traditional and indigenous knowledge, innovation and education, to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. And lastly, to reduce the underlying risk factors to strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response and recovery at all levels, from local to national level. So how have we done this? Through advocacy, as Langi had mentioned. Solidarity is very important, and more important now than before. Countries in the rich and poor can be brought on their knees because of the forces of nature. And this has been happening more frequently than before for us, and the intensity has gone to such a severe level. We have had the floods in the Pacific that has hit us, yet we do not know how to build resilience. What other measures can we take to absorb the impact of the natural disasters? So what that means for us is that we need to become more forceful in our advocacy work, to integrate disaster preparedness and disaster risk reduction in everything we do. And I'm sure you would agree with this, because advocacy is really crucial to transform the behavior, especially to change the mindset of those in the New World and those that are not affected for natural disaster. We just finished the Talanoa session before this, where some of our colleagues from some developed countries shared the experiences of changing older people's mindset who does not believe that climate change is real, because they have not had the first-hand experience of it. So awareness and advocacy plays a very crucial role in order to influence policy decisions. So so the youths go about raising awareness. Sometimes we are blocked off. Sometimes, to build the resilience of the local communities, we engage climate warriors and climate ambassadors, some of them who are present here today with you. So they are championing the process. And they go and talk about the impacts of climate change and how it has affected us, and how you need to become more resilient and implement adaptation measures. In terms of policy change, We have lobbied really hard from our youth perspective. We have had two major policy initiatives. Let me start with the new legislation, which was the National Adaptation Policy 2017. It's currently under review, but will come into force soon. And the other one was the National Climate Change Policy 2012, but it's been recently amended post PC Winston from the lessons that we have learned. The questions that I want to place to the floor today, as well as to elaborate more, is for how can these policies be effective? First, I think to build resilience, which is a universally undefined concept, but for us to be able to adapt and absorb to these disasters or changing climate conditions, we need to be able to understand the risks much better in order to manage them well. We have to bring together the skills and capacities. I'm sure we will all agree in this panel that most of the work that is done on climate change in Fiji or on disaster risk reduction is done by international consultants. How much of it is the Pacific Island people who are the survivors of natural disasters? A very limited number would be there. It would be us, it would be the policymakers sitting in the room and talking about climate change, youth sitting in the room talking about climate change, but the initiation or the work is driven by the international consultant that has very limited knowledge of first-hand experience of how impactful or how devastating this experience are. Sorry for being a bit emotional. Second, we have to bring together, I've done second. Third, we have to be able to work in a more flexible manner so that we can deploy the skills and the capacities when the disaster strikes at home or in overseas. So how can we be able to deploy more effective humanitarian action when it happens so that people are able to absorb the effects and be able to recover from it in a more responsive manner? Fourth, we must be able to provide incentives to change behavior. Incentives, when I say incentives here, I'm saying that we can put together, in other words, ways in which we can mobilize adaptation strategies. So we can ask, because it's going to be hard to ask people to move away from their land. So what can we do? Can we build them another house to move to another area? Or what are some of the strategies that we can do? What are some of the things that youths can lobby for changes in by the national government, to include a line item on or for climate change fund to be mainstreamed into all work programs across, so that these ministries can also help their target population. And we also need to send signals to households and businesses to see how insurance industry can perform. When I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD, I found out there's only 3 out of the 9 insurance agencies in Fiji that offer some sort of insurance. However, it is very costly, and most households are not insured. It's the businesses. And the businesses that are insured are larger businesses. It's not the small, medium-sized enterprises. So if you are a social entrepreneur, or if you have a small, medium-sized enterprise such as a poultry farm, you are likely to be more vulnerable and not have insurance. Whereas in developed countries, it's more easier for you to have access to insurance policies. So this is another way that youths are trying to lobby for insurance companies to try and integrate within their current policy mechanisms other options, policy options for small, medium-sized enterprises and households to be able to access these insurance policies. For me, looking at the future, I'll end with the slogan, is we have to make sure that the dog that doesn't bark is nevertheless heard loud and clear. So we need to make this our priority, that we are living in a vulnerable, we are living in a disaster-prone region. We are vulnerable to natural disasters, but how can we build disaster resilience? How can we address the vulnerabilities? How can we do something to enhance our adaptive capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, Sivendra. Hi, my name is Amasai Cheke, and I'm a young trans feminist from Fiji. Since my colleague has taken up so much of our time, I'll keep it really short. So as a young trans woman from the Global South at this time, where we are experiencing climate, ecological, and political crisis, one of the most important things that we could to consider how resources are moved geopolitically and how it's important to consider, when we are located in the Pacific. And I always say this, that it's important that, we use a feminist social justice framework of interlinkage analysis. System change relates to the need to address a much broader issue that involve different access to power and resources, food insecurity, climate change and human rights, and inequality and poverty. One of the main things that we talk about as young people is barriers in terms of cultural, social barriers. But one thing that we can never talk about is power within young movement, within the youth movement, is how people who are privileged have power over moving the conversation, and how it gets to be moved from someone who lives in the small island development states and for someone who lives at the global level. So one of the great work that young women are doing in the Pacific, who are engaged in many areas of work to address climate change, disasters, and for social, economic, and ecological advance towards a just, equitable, and ecological sustainable world. Many further recognize that common resources of air, water, the land, the ocean, and the biodiversity must be collectively recognized and protected, because these commons form the basis of the global ecosphere that are essential to all lives and required to be sustainable. Climate change and disaster and the loss of biodiversity, social and economic injustice, and ecological duration is very linked to the urgency of addressing the issues from an integrated and ecological standpoint to the well-established by signed and experienced in international agreements such as the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. In which one of our recent research that we just finished back at home on DRR, post-Winston, where issues relating to Cyclone Winston was where we found that general religious belief that climate change and disaster were brought about the nature of sinful world of where LGBT people were blamed for the causes of disaster and climate change, and where homosexuality and the people of diverse gender were put at the top of the sin list. LGBT people were often blamed because of the bad things, especially climate change and disasters happening in the world. So in May 2017, post-disaster needs assessment to TC Winston analysis that disaster effects and impacts for the purpose of identifying recovery needs as they are understood from a human, social, cultural, economic, and environmental perspective. However, it does not analyze effects of and impacts on gender and sexual minorities, and offer no recommendations on addressing SOGI issues in the recovery and in the program of mitigation future disaster impacts. Constantly, LGBT people are left behind in these processes when we talk about the importance of including LGBT people in the processes of disaster risk reduction in terms of mitigation and adaptation. We currently talk about in this forum, we talk about solidarity and building social movement, but still we see that LGBT people are still left behind, and LGBT people are shut at the forefront. We've come past the Millennium Development Goals, and now we are going towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And we keep talking about leaving no one behind, but who really are we leaving behind? And constantly LGBT people are the ones that are left behind. in terms of climate change, in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights. And one of the main conversations that we always have is post-Winston at the rehabilitation center, trans people weren't given the full access to, to acquire, to go to evacuation centers because they were scared of being told off that, because of them, that Winston decided to come to Fiji to do a big cleanup to remove LGBT people from Fiji. So yeah, that's one of the great work that we continuously to do is we still join and try and make policies change, and we're trying to hold the government accountable for having one of the most, Fiji had one of the most very prestigious constitution under Section 26, where it talks about that no one should be discriminated on the basis of your sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. But that's bullshit. But we are still, LGBT people are still discriminated, marginalized, and are still stigmatized because of who we are and how we look and how do, but when we talk about our culture, older people will talk about how the existence of feminine man existed back in the days, but that kind of conversation is no longer allowed to be talked about because of religion. And these are some of the big barriers that we have. And I'll leave it question and answers.
Being conscious of the time, we have 30 minutes left. Thank you, Kaya, for your presentation on climate change and interlinking that to land sovereignty. Michael, interlinking that with disaster risk resilience. And Amasai, on the need to always have a gender lens and also the importance of integrating a human rights approach, a framework into whatever work under climate change that we are doing. So now I'm just going to open the floor for any for question and answers. So if you have a question, can I have someone to come and take the mic around? Yeah, Nikhil maybe? So Nikhil is going to walk around with a mic. If you can, please just introduce yourself, your name and from which country or which organization you're from and who you are directing your questions to. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Nadia and I'm from Vienna, Austria. And I had a question for Kaya. Is this the right name? Yeah. You said that you reject the notion of climate refugees. And I think it would be really interesting if you want to elaborate a bit more on that.
I think we only have one mic, so I'll just use my big Fijian voice and talk really loudly. So really, basically, if you look at a lot of the media, a lot of Pacific people and a lot of our leaders say that we are not refugees, we will not become refugees, and that's predominantly due to the fact that the cultural significance and importance that land plays to us and our historical and familial ties towards land. Oh, it's working. Okay, it's working now. But being a lawyer, I see everything through a legal lens. And that means that, to me, when people see refugees, they just think about the concept of people fleeing. But with law, refugees are governed by a number of different treaties, the first and foremost being the 1956 Refugee Convention. Under this convention, it stipulates and defines what a refugee is. And this means that a person who is a refugee can only be a person who is forced to flee their homelands, who is outside of their homelands, due to a human agent who is persecuting them on the grounds of a very restricted criteria, and it's usually things such as religion, trade unions. The criteria and the law itself is written for the refugee crisis that happened post-World War II, when a lot of European individuals were fleeing Europe and into America and other parts of the world. And so the Refugee Convention is drafted around these parameters. It does not allow for anybody to flee on the grounds of climate change and environment unless the environment is being used by a human being to essentially persecute another individual, and that is a very difficult criteria to meet. For climate change, the fundamental issue about being a refugee is that there is no way to determine a single human agent has contributed climate emission X, which is then affecting me in my home, forcing me to flee, essentially. And so therein lies the issue. So while there is a lot of mana or gravitas or importance attached to the concept of refugee, and people know in their minds when you say the word refugee, they automatically have this image of, people with, just carrying what they have, their meager belongings, and running away from their home due to a very terrible situation. It has that sort of, strikes that image and that connotation of a climate refugee, someone fleeing in that sense. But within law, it is incorrect and actually does not exist to say climate refugee. It would essentially be a climate displaced person. Yeah. Does that answers your question? Sorry. Once you get a lawyer talking, we generally don't stop.
Thank you. My name is Helen and I'm from New Caledonia, so I'm feeling very concerned about all of that. I was wondering if there is a kind of coalition or something you're working on, like to gather all movement like yours in the Pacific, and because I know that in New Caledonia there is not so many people speaking about climate change, and it's not only about climate change, it's about also gender issues, that they are the same in New Caledonia. So I was wondering if you were working with other Pacific islands on this, and how, and what are you doing? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there is, within Fiji, there are a lot of LGBT organizations. Specifically, I'm speaking on LGBT organization. And we have the Rainbow Coalition, which is made up of all LGBT organizations that are part of it. And at the regional level, we have all these organizations that are part of the Rainbow Coalition, which are part of the Pacific Sexual Gender Diversity Network, which is a regional body that looks after LGBT organizations from across the Pacific, and where we talk about advancing human rights in the Pacific, reporting on UPR, on CEDAW, and pushing for CEDAW to where countries that have not yet ratified CEDAW, and also reporting at the Human Rights Council, where we have a shadow report where we have position papers pushed at the global level. And we are also part of the ILGA Oceania, which is part of the ILGA Global. Yes, so.
Maybe if you were asking with regards to youth climate movements or climate movements in general, we haven't begun to form coalition yet, simply because we are under-resourced and also because of the distance between each countries. But there is, under the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, we have organizations, civil society, and social movement that works around climate change or disaster resilience, being part of this climate action network. Specifically for Project Survival Pacific, we have Fiji's youth climate movement, but we do not exclude members from other countries. We have members from as far as Papua New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, as well as Tuvalu and Kiribati. And we try to involve them in our programs and capacity building trainings, workshops. We try to involve them in our activities. So with the thinking that they'll go back to their islands and they'll sort of try to influence other young people or replicate and try to upscale what we are doing in Fiji in their own individual countries. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that point, there's definitely a call for support, a call to recognize that organizations, youth organizations particularly, do not have sufficient resources to form a coalition. And also, basically, youth organizations that are currently there are many, but we always have an issue of working in silos or lack of coordination and collaboration. So therefore, the need for coalition is very much important. What is more worrying as well is, just to speak more on this point, is that when we form coalitions, there are some coalitions that can also work at different levels. Some may be confronting the government's actions, and the others may be just working towards implementation of the current policies and so forth. So not more so to hold someone to accountable, but more so to drive action. So those levels need to be actually clarified before we go into forming a coalition as well. It's very much needed at this stage. It's also very much needed at the regional organization stage, because there's a lot of regional organizations, a lot of UN agencies that are based in Fiji. We are the hub of and then SPC is based in Noumea. So we need that collaboration and coordination, because something that happens in Noumea, also there's a hub in Fiji. We need that coordination so that because they have a youth network as well called Pacific Youth Network. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah from Germany, and I have the question, how is it for you, or do you meet with people from, like companies that are some sort of we could say, causes of big amounts of carbon dioxide? So do you, I don't know, but like, do you meet people who other people could blame for their behavior and sort of just accelerating climate change? And when do you do so? What is it like? Maybe to clarify, just did you understand what I mean? Yeah, okay.
So you were asking basically, do we ever end up in situations where we're actually at the same tables with large emitters or people who we would say are some of the larger emitters? I'm not sure about the rest of my colleagues up here, but for me personally, oftentimes the times I have found myself in those situations have usually been at COPs. And it's usually around those debates of keeping large emitters in the tent or out of the tent. It's always very strange. I had this one particular run-in, not so much a company, but in Lima at COP20. We were at one of the pavilions and they were giving out free coffee. And after a few days at COP, you're usually running purely on coffee. We went up to get some, and the guy who was giving out had changed, and it was no longer somebody from Peru, it was an individual from Saudi Arabia. So we started chatting with him, and then we found out that he was one of the lead negotiators for Saudi Arabia, but he was also, his day job was a CEO of an oil company. And so you have to ask yourself in those situations, what interests are there you know, I think early on I would have gotten very frustrated at these individuals being like, you are the issue in these negotiations, you're stalling them, you're frustrating the process. But I think now there is a place and a time for it, and there's a place and a time on whether they should be in or should be out. Yeah. It's hard. I don't know. Within my work, I don't generally meet with too many, you know, the heads of car companies and the heads of oil companies, you know, so.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as she mentioned, yeah, sometimes for like youth-led movements, to bring them on the same table will be really difficult. So one of the strategies that we usually use is the social entrepreneur strategy. So how can they support in like buying our products and stuff, and then we tell them that we are actually going to use the funds to address a climate issue or cultural need within our communities. So much not, it happens on a day-to-day basis. It's quite hard as well to approach bigger organizations like Vodafone and Fiji Airways, but they are on board. Like in the last session we said that Fiji Airways now plants 1 mangrove per international flight it makes. So it's little, but not so much of the work that, not so much that can be done more. They can do much more. But I think we were just talking about it is, all three of us would agree to this, is that we are in the phase where we are not more on the blaming game, we are more on the, we've changed our approach, like there's no more blaming that you are doing this, or yeah, we've changed approach, we're working to battle it together. So Climate for Action is like we're creating the movement to battle it together hand in hand, because other bigger countries we know are polluting way more. We are actually emitting 0.00 something. So yeah, we are trying to work together, and we're not blaming or pointing fingers at each other, but rather working together collaboratively.
Just before he asks his question, I might just add on to that. I think as youth we can be bold from a NGO perspective. In the room, you can actually stand up and sorry. So being in a room, you can actually stand up and address the elephants